As we've been having this conversation, a statement has come now from Donald Trump about this. So this is just in. I want to read this. I'm going to read this in part. There's the top of it just reads like a Twitter rant, so I'm going to kind of get to about a paragraph into it. It says, so now, for more than 2 years, New York City has been looking at almost every transaction I've ever done, including seeking tax returns, which were done by among the biggest and most prestigious law and accounting firms in the U.S. The Tea Party was treated far better by the IRS than Donald Trump. The Supreme Court never should have let this fishing expedition happen, but they did. This is something which has never happened to a president before. It is all Democrat inspired in a totally Democrat location, New York City and state, completely controlled and dominated by a heavily reported enemy of mine, Governor Andrew Cuomo. These are attacks by Democrats willing to do anything to stop the almost 75 million people, the most votes by far ever gotten by a sitting president.
Okay, so here's what just happened, and this is actually terrifying if you understand what's at stake. Like, are you kidding me right now? The Supreme Court is looking at Trump's emergency tariffs, and if the justices rule against him, the federal government might have to refund up to $1 trillion to importers. $1 trillion. That's not a typo. That's not hyperbole. That's what could actually happen if the Supreme Court decides that Trump's tariffs were illegal, and Trump knows this. He's panicking. He's warning about economic disaster. He's basically saying that if the court rules against him, it's going to destroy the economy. And come on, this is the kind of story that affects your wallet, affects your job, affects everything about how the economy works.
But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
What you hear kind of quietly from Republicans is that in the absence of them having the kind of political courage to speak out against Donald Trump, they're hoping basically that prosecutors do that for them, that this kind of becomes a big enough issue that the people who are hoping to take over the Republican Party from Donald Trump, in the back of their head and kind of off record and on background, they're saying, well, look at these legal issues, and that may be what stops him. I think what former Congresswoman Comstock is saying is just floating that out loud, saying that the Congress could potentially pass a law. I remember some Democrats on the trail talking about this to make sure that the next, that any type of nominee would have to open their tax returns, and that will potentially.
Here, so you understand the stakes. Trump came into his second term, and he started imposing tariffs. He imposed them under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the IEEPA. He claimed national security. He said these tariffs were necessary to protect America. He said they were emergency measures. So he started collecting billions and billions of dollars in tariff revenue. Every time someone imports a good into the United States, they have to pay tariffs. Every month, more money flows into the federal government, billions of dollars, month after month after month. The tariff revenue just keeps piling up. But here's the problem, and this is huge. The Supreme Court is now questioning whether Trump had the legal authority to impose these tariffs in the first place. The IEEPA might not actually give the president the power to impose tariffs. Legal experts are saying that Trump might have stretched the law way beyond what it actually allows. The language in the IEEPA is about regulating importation, but it's not clear that it means the president can just slap tariffs on everything. It's ambiguous. It's vague. And the Supreme Court is looking at whether Trump's interpretation of that law is actually legal. And if the court rules that Trump didn't have the authority to impose these tariffs, then legally, the money that was collected has to be returned. The federal government has to refund the tariffs that were collected illegally, and we're talking about massive amounts of money here. The estimates are ranging from hundreds of billions to potentially $1 trillion in refunds. That's money that importers paid in tariffs that would have to be given back. That's money that the federal government has been counting on for its budget. That's money that Trump has been bragging about collecting. Now let's think about what this actually means in real-world terms. Tens of billions of dollars have already been collected this year alone. Billions every single month. The longer the Supreme Court takes to rule, the more tariff revenue accumulates. The bigger the potential refund obligation becomes. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent actually went to the Supreme Court and basically begged the justices to rule quickly. He said that every month that goes by, the potential refund burden grows larger. He was basically saying, come on, if you're going to rule against Trump's tariffs, do it now, while the refund obligation is smaller, not later, when it's enormous. And Trump is panicking about this. He's been out there saying that the United States faces economic disaster if the Supreme Court rules against his tariffs. He's being pretty dramatic about it, but here's the thing. He's actually right that this would be a serious problem. If the federal government suddenly has to refund $1 trillion, that's a massive financial shock to the system. That's money the government was counting on. That's money that affects the federal budget. That's money that could create huge problems for the Treasury Department. That could create cash flow problems. That could affect the government's ability to function. It's a real issue. Some legal experts are calling this a potential governance breakdown. They're comparing it to what happens when a major corporation is over-leveraged and suddenly realizes it has massive obligations it can't meet. It's like a financial bomb. It's like the government suddenly discovering that it owes $1 trillion that it didn't expect to owe. And the government doesn't have $1 trillion just sitting around. The government would have to figure out how to pay this. It would have to cut spending somewhere. It would have to find money somewhere. It would have to make very difficult decisions about what to fund and what not to fund. Now, you might be thinking, well, okay, so if the court rules against Trump, the government refunds the tariffs. That's just how the legal system works, right? If something was done illegally, you have to undo it. You have to make the people who were harmed whole. You have to return the money that was collected illegally. That's basic legal principle. That's how justice works. But the problem is that this would be such a massive refund obligation that it could actually shake confidence in the government. It could shake confidence in Trump's administration. It could create market volatility. It could create economic chaos. Because think about it from the perspective of businesses that paid these tariffs. If the Supreme Court says that Trump's tariffs were illegal, then suddenly all these businesses have a claim against the federal government for the tariffs they paid. Suddenly there's $1 trillion liability hanging over the government. Suddenly the Treasury has to figure out how to handle this enormous obligation. There's going to be lawsuits. There's going to be claims filed. There's going to be chaos. There's going to be people trying to figure out who gets refunded and how much and how quickly. It's going to be a mess. And the financial markets are going to be watching all of this very carefully. If the Supreme Court rules against Trump, if the tariffs are struck down, if there's suddenly $1 trillion refund obligation, the stock market could react negatively. Investors could get nervous. They could lose confidence in Trump's economic policy. They could worry about the government's finances. They could sell stocks and move money out of the United States. That could trigger market volatility. That could trigger economic chaos. That's what Trump is warning about when he says economic disaster. But here's the thing that's really interesting about this situation. Trump is basically saying that the Supreme Court shouldn't rule against him because if they do, it will create economic disaster. He's basically saying that the court needs to rule in his favor to protect the economy. He's basically using the threat of economic chaos as an argument against a court ruling that would be legally correct. He's saying, look, if you rule against me, it's going to be bad for the economy, so please don't rule against me. He's basically trying to intimidate the court into ruling in his favor by threatening economic disaster. And that's a pretty wild argument because it's basically saying that the president can do illegal things as long as the consequences of undoing those illegal things would be bad. It's basically saying that once you've imposed illegal tariffs for long enough, once you've collected enough money, you get to keep the money because undoing it would be too disruptive. That's not really how the law is supposed to work, but that's what Trump is arguing. And his argument is resonating with some people because yeah, economic chaos would be bad. Yeah, $1 trillion refund would be disruptive. Yeah, the markets would react negatively. But the Supreme Court is in a tough spot because if they rule against Trump, if they say the tariffs were illegal, then logically, the refunds have to happen. The law says the refunds have to happen. You can't rule that something was done illegally and then say, oh, but we're not going to enforce the legal consequences because it would be too disruptive. That's not how justice works. That's not how the law works. So the Supreme Court is facing this situation where they have to choose between upholding the law, which means Trump loses and there's a massive refund obligation, or somehow finding a way to let Trump keep his tariffs and avoid the refund disaster. Alright, so let's really dig into what the refund obligation would actually look like if the Supreme Court rules against Trump, because most people don't fully appreciate how massive this potential problem actually is. We're not talking about a few $billions here or there. We're talking about potentially $1 trillion. That's a 1 followed by 12 zeros. That's an unfathomable amount of money. That's more than the federal government spends on defense in a year. That's more than the federal government spends on education in a year. That's a staggering amount of money that would have to be refunded. Let's break down the numbers. According to the estimates from economic analysts and legal experts, if Trump's tariffs are ruled illegal, the refund obligation could reach somewhere between $500 billion and $1 trillion, depending on how much tariff revenue has been collected and how long the tariffs have been in effect. We're talking tens of billions of dollars already collected this year alone. That's from November through December. January, February, March, April, May, June of 2026. Potentially more months of tariff collection. Every single month that goes by without a court ruling, billions more in potential refund obligations accumulate. This number is growing literally every single day. Now, from the perspective of the Treasury Department, from the perspective of Scott Bessent and Trump's economic team, this is an absolute nightmare scenario because the federal government doesn't have $1 trillion sitting in a rainy day fund. The federal government operates on a budget. Money comes in through taxes and tariffs and other revenue sources. Money goes out for spending on defense, Social Security, Medicare, roads, schools, everything. The budget is carefully balanced. Well, not balanced. The budget has deficits, but it's carefully managed. And suddenly discovering that you have a $1 trillion liability that you didn't plan for is absolutely catastrophic from a financial management perspective. Here's what would probably happen if the Supreme Court ruled that Trump's tariffs were illegal. First, there would be lawsuits. Hundreds of thousands of importers who paid tariffs would file claims against the federal government demanding refunds. The Treasury Department would have to set up a system to process these refund claims. They would have to verify how much each importer paid. They would have to calculate interest on the refunds because money that was taken in 2025 and returned in 2026 loses value. Importers would argue that they deserve compensation for the lost value of their money. Then the Treasury would have to actually pay out the refunds. They would have to write checks or transfer money to banks for all these importers. Now, where does the Treasury get this money? They can't just magic it into existence. They have to come up with it. They could cut government spending. They could lay off federal employees. They could cut military spending. They could cut Social Security. They could cut Medicare. They could cut funding for roads and bridges and schools. Any of those things would be politically catastrophic for Trump and for Republicans. Or the government could borrow money. The Treasury could issue new bonds to raise money to pay for the refunds, but that would increase the national debt. That would mean the United States is borrowing more money to pay for something that should never have happened in the first place. Or the government could raise taxes, they could increase income taxes or corporate taxes to raise revenue to pay for the refunds, but that would also be politically catastrophic. Trump ran on cutting taxes and keeping them low. The idea that Trump would have to raise taxes to cover an illegal tariff refund scheme would be terrible for his political agenda. It would undermine his entire economic message. So the Trump administration is in a bind. They don't want to cut spending. They don't want to raise taxes. They don't want to issue more debt, but they might have to do one of those things if the Supreme Court rules against them. And here's where the economic disaster narrative comes in, because if the government suddenly has to deal with a $1 trillion refund obligation, it could create real economic problems. The stock market could get nervous, investors could lose confidence, there could be market volatility, the value of the dollar could be affected, inflation could spike, interest rates could go up. All of these things could happen as a result of this massive financial shock to the system. It could be genuinely disruptive to the economy. But here's the thing that's really important to understand, and this is the core of the legal and constitutional issue. This is all Trump's fault. This entire disaster is a direct result of Trump imposing tariffs illegally. Trump is the one who stretched the IEEPA beyond what it actually allows. Trump is the one who imposed tariffs under a law that he didn't have clear authority to use. Trump is the one who collected billions of dollars under an arguably illegal scheme. So the fact that undoing this illegal scheme would create economic chaos doesn't mean it shouldn't be undone. It means Trump shouldn't have done it in the first place. That's the fundamental legal problem here. You can't say, I did something illegal, and because undoing it would be disruptive, I should be allowed to keep the money and keep doing the illegal thing. That's not how justice works. That's not how the law works. If something is illegal, it has to be undone. The consequences be damned. That's the whole point of the rule of law. That's the whole point of the Constitution. That's the whole point of having a Supreme Court. You follow the law even when it's inconvenient. You follow the law even when it creates problems. But Trump is arguing that the Supreme Court should basically ignore this principle because the consequences would be too severe. He's saying that a $1 trillion refund would be an economic disaster, so the court should rule that his tariffs were legal even if they weren't. He's basically saying that the court should put economic stability ahead of the rule of law. He's saying that the court should let him keep the money even though it was collected illegally because undoing it would be disruptive. And here's where this gets really dangerous from a constitutional perspective, because if the Supreme Court agrees with Trump, if the court says, well, we think your tariffs might be illegal, but the refund obligation would be too disruptive, so we're going to rule that they were legal anyway, then you've basically established a principle that the president can do illegal things as long as the consequences of undoing them are bad enough. That's a really dangerous principle. That's a principle that undermines the rule of law. What if a future president uses that same logic for something else? What if a future president imposes taxes illegally, collects billions of dollars, and then says, well, if you try to enforce the law against me, you're going to create economic chaos? What if a future president spends money illegally, and when Congress tries to stop him, he says, well, if you enforce the law, it's going to create economic disaster? You see how this logic could expand beyond just tariffs. You see how this could become a general principle that lets the president break the law whenever the consequences of enforcing the law would be inconvenient. That's why this case is so important. It's not just about tariffs, it's about whether the president is constrained by the law, or whether the president can do illegal things if he claims it would be economically disruptive to undo them. It's about whether the Supreme Court is willing to stand up to Trump and enforce the law even when it's inconvenient, or whether the Supreme Court is going to cave to economic intimidation. Okay, so let's talk about what this actually means for you. What does this mean if the Supreme Court rules against Trump and suddenly there's a $1 trillion refund obligation? What happens to the economy? What happens to your job? What happens to prices at the store? What happens to the stock market? What happens to everything? Well, first of all, if the Supreme Court rules against Trump, the tariffs get struck down. That means all the tariffs that Trump imposed are no longer legal. All the tariffs that were in effect get repealed. Importers no longer have to pay tariffs on those goods. That's good for importers. That's good for people who want to buy cheap foreign goods. That's good for consumers because prices on imported goods will come down. But it's bad for American manufacturers who were protected by those tariffs. It's bad for American steel makers and aluminum makers and automakers. They lose the tariff protection that Trump gave them. But the really big consequence is the refund obligation. The government has to refund up to $1 trillion to importers who paid tariffs, and this is where the economic chaos comes in. Because suddenly, the federal government has this massive liability. The Treasury Department has to figure out how to pay it, and as we discussed, they have limited options. They can cut spending, raise taxes, or borrow money. None of those options are good. Cutting spending could slow the economy. Raising taxes could slow the economy. Borrowing money could push up interest rates and slow the economy. So any way the government deals with this refund obligation, it could have negative economic consequences. The stock market could react badly to this news. If investors think that the government is going to have to cut spending to pay for these refunds, they might worry about a recession. They might sell stocks. The stock market could go down. People's retirement accounts could lose value. People's 401ks could lose value. That could affect consumer confidence. People might feel poorer. People might cut back on spending. And if people cut back on spending, the economy slows down. That could lead to layoffs. That could lead to higher unemployment. That could lead to an actual economic recession. Or if investors think that the government is going to borrow money to pay for the refunds, they might worry about inflation. They might worry about the national debt getting too high. They might sell treasury bonds. The value of the dollar could go down. Interest rates could go up. If interest rates go up, then mortgage rates go up. Your car loan rates go up. Your credit card rates go up. Everything that costs money to borrow gets more expensive. That could slow down the economy. That could lead to less spending, less investment, less business activity. That could lead to a recession. So Trump is actually not entirely wrong when he says that the Supreme Court ruling against his tariffs could create economic problems. The refund obligation is so large that dealing with it could have real negative effects on the economy. But here's the thing. Trump created this problem. Trump imposed the illegal tariffs. Trump collected the money. Trump is responsible for this situation. So the fact that it's economically disruptive doesn't mean the law shouldn't be enforced. It just means Trump shouldn't have done it in the first place. Now let's talk about what happens if the Supreme Court rules in Trump's favor. If the court says that the IEEPA allows Trump to impose tariffs, then Trump wins. He keeps his tariffs. He keeps the money he's collected. He gets to keep imposing tariffs. There's no refund obligation. The federal government keeps the tariff revenue. The Treasury Department is happy. Trump is happy. His supporters are happy. From an economic management perspective, there's no immediate crisis. But here's what's bad about that outcome. If the court rules that the IEEPA allows tariffs, then the president basically has unlimited power to impose tariffs whenever he wants, whenever he claims national security. That's a massive expansion of executive power. That means future presidents can use the IEEPA for tariffs too. That means any president can impose tariffs on any country whenever they want, without going to Congress, without asking permission. That's a big problem for the rule of law and separation of powers. But from an immediate economic perspective, from the perspective of the next few months and the next couple of years, if Trump wins, there's no economic disaster. There's no refund crisis. There's no massive financial shock to the system. The economy continues under Trump's tariff regime. Some people think that's good. Some people think that's bad. But there's no immediate crisis. So you've got this situation where ruling against Trump creates short-term economic chaos, but enforces the rule of law. And ruling for Trump avoids economic chaos, but violates the rule of law, and expands executive power. It's a really tough situation for the Supreme Court. It's a genuinely difficult choice, and Trump is basically saying that the court should choose the option that avoids economic chaos, which happens to be the option that benefits Trump. Now here's what's really interesting about Trump's strategy in this whole thing. He's been very vocal about warning about economic disaster. He's been very clear that ruling against his tariffs would be bad for the economy. He's been making this argument very publicly. He's been basically trying to intimidate the Supreme Court into ruling in his favor by threatening economic chaos. He's saying, if you rule against me, bad things are going to happen to the economy, so please don't rule against me. This is a form of pressure on the court. It's a form of intimidation. It's Trump basically threatening the justices and saying that if they rule against him, there will be economic consequences. He's using the threat of economic chaos as a bargaining chip. He's using it as leverage. He's trying to influence the outcome of the case by making it clear what the consequences will be if the court rules against him. And here's the thing. The markets are probably already pricing in some of this uncertainty. The stock market is probably already reflecting the possibility that the Supreme Court could rule against Trump. The bond market is probably already thinking about what it would mean if there's a $1 trillion refund obligation. Investors are probably already nervous about this situation. So the economic uncertainty is already being felt, even before the Supreme Court has ruled. And when the court does rule, whenever that happens, the market reaction could be significant. If the court rules against Trump, the market could drop sharply because investors suddenly realize that there's a $1 trillion refund obligation. If the court rules for Trump, the market could rally because investors realize that the refund nightmare is avoided. Either way, this is going to have big economic consequences. So when you hear Trump talking about economic disaster, when you hear him warning about the consequences of a Supreme Court ruling against his tariffs, understand that he's not just making a prediction. He's not just making an economic observation. He's basically making a threat. He's basically saying that if the Supreme Court rules against him, the economy is going to suffer, and that's going to be on the court. That's his message. That's his argument. That's how he's trying to influence the outcome. And the Supreme Court is now facing this decision. Do they enforce the law and let the chips fall where they may economically? Or do they try to thread the needle and find some way to rule that doesn't create massive economic chaos? Or do they just rule in Trump's favor to avoid the whole mess? That's what they're grappling with. That's the decision they have to make, and it's going to be one of the most consequential decisions of Trump's second term. Make sure you're subscribed, because when that Supreme Court ruling comes down, we're going to break it down for you in detail. We're going to explain what it means for the economy. We're going to explain what it means for the tariffs. We're going to explain what it means for Trump's second term agenda. This is the kind of story that's going to shape everything going forward.